Imagine being handed a sword, a shield, and told that dying today was actually the best thing that could happen to you, not a joke, not propaganda. A genuine belief, held by hundreds of thousands of men across 5 centuries of warfare. The Roman soldier didn't just accept death. In many cases, he quietly welcomed it. But how? How do you train an entire army to stop fearing the one thing every human brain is wired to avoid? The answer isn't what you think. It wasn't madness. It wasn't blind loyalty. It was something far more calculated, far more chilling. And once you understand it, you'll never look at the Roman Empire the same way again. Let's set the scene. You are 19 years old. It is 60 AD. You've just been conscripted into the Roman legions. You own nothing except the clothes on your back and a name your father gave you. Within 6 months, you will march over 20 miles a day in full armor. You will carry a pack weighing close to 45 kilograms. You will sleep on frozen ground, eat stale grain mixed with water, and follow orders from men who have the legal right to execute you on the spot. And yet, the soldiers around you aren't broken. They aren't crying. They aren't trying to run. They are proud. Some of them are actually eager to get to the front line. There is something happening inside the Roman military machine that modern psychology is only beginning to fully understand. A system so deeply embedded into daily life that by the time a Roman soldier walked onto a battlefield, death had already been redefined for him, not as an ending, as a destination. Let's break it down. It starts before the battlefield, before the march, before the armor. It starts with identity. When a young Roman man was inducted into the legions, something profound happened on day 1. His old self was stripped away. Literally. His civilian clothes were removed. His head was shaved. He was given a new name, his legion number and unit rank. He was no longer Marcus, the farmer's son from Campania. He was now a soldier of the 8th Legion, and that distinction meant everything. Roman military culture was built on one foundational idea. The group survives. The individual does not matter. This wasn't cruelty. It was engineering. Because the moment a soldier stopped seeing himself as an individual, the moment his identity fused with his unit, the fear of personal death began to dissolve. You couldn't be afraid of dying if you no longer fully existed as a separate being. Modern military psychologists call this unit cohesion. The Romans had no word for it. They just built it into every single hour of every single day. Your tent group was 8 men. You ate with them. You slept with them. You trained with them. You shared a single leather tent the size of a small bathroom. For years. These weren't friends. They were something closer. Something the Romans called contubernium. Literally, those who share a tent. And here is where it gets fascinating. When one of those men died in battle, something counterintuitive happened inside the survivors. Instead of fear and retreat, Roman soldiers reported rage, focus, a sharpening of purpose. Because dying alongside your tent brothers wasn't a tragedy. It was the fulfillment of an obligation. And that obligation had been drilled into them since day 1. Now let's talk about the culture outside the tent. Because it wasn't just military training that built this mindset. It was Roman society itself. Rome had an obsession with dying well that bordered on religious. From childhood, Roman boys were raised on stories of soldiers who chose death over dishonor. Horatius, who stood alone on a bridge against an entire army. Regulus, who returned to Carthage to be tortured rather than break his word. These weren't distant myths. They were taught at dinner tables, carved into temple walls, recited in the Forum. The Roman concept of virtus, which we loosely translate as virtue, actually meant something far more physical. It came from the word vir, meaning man, true manhood. And true manhood, in Rome, meant the willingness to sacrifice your body for the collective. A soldier who died bravely in battle didn't just die. He became memoria, living memory. His name would be spoken, his unit would carry his legacy, his family would receive honor, sometimes land, sometimes payment. A soldier who ran, who surrendered, who begged for his life on the battlefield. That man ceased to exist in any meaningful Roman sense. He returned home to silence, to shame, to a life considered worse than death by everyone around him. So the Roman soldier faced a very specific psychological equation every time he walked into battle. Die bravely, live forever in memory. Survive with cowardice, die slowly in shame. When you frame it that way, the sword starts to look a lot less terrifying. But here's where it gets even deeper. The Romans didn't just rely on cultural conditioning. They engineered the physical experience of battle to make death feel less real, until it was too late to be afraid. Before combat, Roman soldiers performed rituals that today would look almost meditative. They sharpened their weapons in unison. They polished their armor together. They made sacrifices to the gods, specifically to Mars, the god of war, and to the unit's own guardian spirit, the Aquila, the golden eagle standard carried at the front of every legion. That eagle was not just a symbol. It was the soul of the unit. Losing it in battle was considered the greatest possible shame, worse than death. Entire legions were disbanded, their numbers erased from Roman records, if their eagle was captured. But here's the psychological trick nobody talks about. By centering all that collective identity on an object rather than a person, Rome ensured that soldiers would throw themselves into almost suicidal positions to protect it. In 9 AD, when 3 Roman legions were massacred in the Teutoburg forest, nearly 20,000 men wiped out in 3 days. The survivors who escaped weren't relieved to be alive. They were devastated. Because 3 eagles had been lost, 3 unit souls had been taken. Augustus Caesar reportedly walked the halls of his palace for weeks afterward, banging his head against the walls, shouting, "Varus, give me back my legions." Those soldiers who survived would have given anything to have died with their eagle. That is how deep the conditioning ran. Now let's talk about what it actually felt like. On the ground, in the body. Because this story isn't just about culture and psychology. It's about flesh and blood and exhaustion and fear. A Roman soldier on campaign woke before sunrise, every day. No exceptions. He ate a breakfast of grain porridge, called pulse, sometimes with a small piece of hard cheese or a few olives. That was it. That was the fuel for a day that might include a 20-mile forced march, followed by the construction of a full military camp, followed by weapons training, followed by 4 hours of guard duty. His feet were constantly blistered. His shoulders were permanently bruised from the pack straps. His hands were calloused to the point of feeling almost nothing. By the time a battle arrived, and remember, battles were actually rare compared to the endless march and camp life, many Roman soldiers described feeling something unexpected. Relief. Because battle meant stopping. It meant the march was over. It meant that the slow, grinding misery of camp life was replaced by something with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Ancient sources record soldiers joking before combat, laughing, sharing wine, some sharpening their blades with the calm focus of a craftsman preparing for a day's work. This wasn't insanity. It was the result of something profound. When life is hard enough for long enough, death stops being the worst option available. The Roman military understood this intuitively. The harder they pushed their soldiers in training, the more combat began to feel like release rather than terror. Vegetius, the Roman military writer, recorded it plainly. The more sweat in training, the less blood in battle. But what he didn't write, what he left between the lines, was the darker truth. The more suffering in daily life, the less frightening the suffering of death becomes. Now let's talk about what happened when soldiers failed to embrace this mindset, because Rome had a system for that too. And it was brutal. The most feared punishment in the Roman military wasn't execution. It wasn't flogging. It wasn't prison. It was decimation. If a unit retreated without orders, showed cowardice in battle, or mutinied, the punishment was this. Every 10th man in the unit was chosen by lottery, and then killed, by his own comrades. Think about what that does to a soldier's mind. You are standing in a line. A blind draw is being made. You watch the man beside you, your tent brother, the man you've eaten with for 3 years. receive the marked stone, and then you are ordered to beat him to death with your fists. Not a sword. Not a quick ending. Your hands. This wasn't random cruelty. It was precision psychology. Because after decimation, the surviving soldiers didn't hate Rome. Studies of Roman military records show something remarkable. Units that survived decimation often became some of the most ferocious fighters in the entire army. Because now, death in battle had been recalibrated against something even worse. Dying on a battlefield, surrounded by enemies, with a sword in your hand. That was clean. That was honorable. That was the good death. Dying at the hands of your brothers in camp, in disgrace, while your legion watched. That was unthinkable. Rome had essentially created a hierarchy of deaths, and battle death sat comfortably at the top. Now let's compare this to the armies Rome was fighting, because context makes this even more remarkable. The Germanic tribes that Rome clashed with for centuries were fierce warriors, terrifying in close combat, deeply brave in their own right, but their courage was emotional. It was driven by rage, by alcohol, by individual glory-seeking. Germanic warriors charged in loose formations, screaming, working themselves into frenzy to overcome fear. Roman soldiers walked into battle in silence, shields locked, steps measured, breathing controlled. No screaming, no frenzy. Just the rhythmic crunch of hobnailed sandals on earth and the cold discipline of men who had already made their peace. The psychological contrast was overwhelming. Carthaginian generals who fought Rome described Roman soldiers as appearing almost inhuman, not because they were fearless, but because their fear was simply not visible. It had been buried so deep, under so many layers of training and culture and identity, that it no longer reached the surface when it mattered most. The Greek historian Polybius, who spent years studying the Roman military, wrote that what separated Rome from every other army he had ever seen was not their weapons or their tactics. It was their relationship with death. Every other army tried to avoid death. Rome had learned to use the idea of death as a weapon. So now we come back to the original question. Why did Roman soldiers secretly welcome death in battle? The answer is that it was never a secret at all. It was a system, an extraordinarily sophisticated, deliberately designed system that operated on every level simultaneously, culturally. Roman boys were raised from childhood to see honorable death as the highest achievement of manhood, psychologically. Unit cohesion dissolved individual identity, making personal survival feel less important than collective honor. Physically, the relentless grinding hardship of military life made the clean finality of battle feel like relief rather than terror. Structurally, punishments like decimation created a hierarchy of deaths that made battlefield death feel not just acceptable, but genuinely preferable to the alternatives. And symbolically, the Eagle Standard gave soldiers something greater than themselves to die for. A soul they could protect even when their own felt expendable. This was not madness. This was not blind obedience. This was 500 years of refinement, of testing, of learning exactly how far you could push the human mind, and exactly what you had to build around it to make it hold. Rome didn't create fearless soldiers. Rome created soldiers who had been given better things to fear than death. And that is why, for 5 centuries, they walked into battles that would have broken any other army on earth. And they walked in smiling. Here's the question I want to leave you with. If modern society, with all its technology, its comfort, its safety, produces so much fear and anxiety, what does that tell us about the relationship between hardship and courage? Were the Romans onto something we've lost? Or were they simply building a machine that consumed men so efficiently that we shouldn't admire it at all? Leave your answer below. I read every single one. And if this got under your skin, wait until you hear what happened to Roman soldiers who survived too many battles. The psychological cost of living through what they lived through. The story is coming next, and it's darker than anything we talked about today.